Hello and welcome to this month's Climate Crisis Advisory Group public meeting. And thank you all for tuning in today. Cities around the world are at the forefront of the climate crisis, whether facing debilitating flooding, energy supply, or climate-driven migration. So if unchecked, these already critical issues will lead to climate catastrophe. So with that in mind, today's focus will be on the role of cities and communities in building a resilient future. By 2050, the world's population will have reached approximately 9.7 billion, and almost 70% of us will be based in urban locations. Yet, these areas are already facing unprecedented challenges. Now, with significant pressures from heat stress, flooding, and strains on infrastructure, meaning more and more people are now living in precarious and dangerous conditions. Urban resilience is therefore more essential than ever to help secure livable conditions for humanity, and well-planned cities also helping to create happy and economically prosperous societies. So, what approach should city officials and planners be taking to build greater resilience to climate change and its impacts? Here to take on this subject, we have a few special guests, including Jayashree Nandi, journalist at the Hindustan Times, Dafa Praditya, activist from Fridays for Future Indonesia, Tamne Tackle, Special Advisor to the Minister for Environment and Climate Change in the government of Maharashtra, and Devi Lockwood, author and ideas editor at the Philadelphia Inquirer. Thank you all for joining us today. Now, I'd like to head over first to Jayashree. Thank you very much for being here today. As a journalist,
thank you.
You cover the environment and climate change in your day-to-day work, and we'd really like to hear a brief introduction from you, and alongside this, your perspective on climate change in India.
Sure. So I write for Hindustan Times. I write on various issues related to environment, like climate change, policies related to environment, wildlife, forests, all of that, and climate negotiations. Now, my perspective on cities, one thing that has been etched in my mind when I started reporting, and also through various stories and experiences, is that energy poverty is stark all around in many Indian cities. You see people, so the way we access energy is very different for different classes of people. For example, the not so privileged do not have any access to cooling mechanism in extreme heat. As you, many of you may be knowing that Delhi is facing extreme heat stress now. We are having severe heat wave in certain parts of the city, even in March, as we speak. And the not so privileged classes, the poor, frankly, do not have any access to cooling systems except for desert coolers or fans. And this kind of heat stress cannot be dealt with those kind of cooling systems. But the rich, on the other hand, say have multiple air conditioners in their homes and air conditioning in their vehicles and all of that. There's a stark difference between how energy is accessed by people and the living and working conditions of people. I think this has been extremely, it has given me a reality check of how people are impacted by climate change, because the poor clearly are disproportionately impacted by climate change, both in terms of health and the way they live and work. This is my takeaway in cities, particularly because the living conditions are also very, very different. And not just heat stress, even during the cold waves, because also cold waves are very common. This is a city of extremes. So during cold waves, there's no heating in for the underprivileged classes. So this is a takeaway. The other two takeaways is that the concept of urban heat island is going up in Delhi and in many Indian cities. So urban heat islands are basically places where the temperature is extremely high and very high compared to other parts of the city, simply because these are built up environments and there's hardly any cooling mechanism in these spaces. Also, the natural spaces, which can act as a protective mechanism against climate change impacts, like forests, rivers, and even the Aravalis. I'll give you an example of Aravalis, which is close to Delhi, bordering Delhi, and also in Haryana. It acts as a barrier against the dust from the desert, from the Thar desert. But increasingly, due to various policies, the governments are trying to change the land use of these mountain ranges. So it is being opened up for various real estate projects and other kinds of land use projects, which I think is a real threat, because Aravalis could act as a mechanism to help adapt to climate change impacts, but increasingly there are policies that are being relaxed. The other thing is about Yamuna. As many of you may be knowing that Yamuna flows through Delhi, but it's more like a sewer drain that is flowing through the city. Nobody wants to talk about it. Everybody wants to sort of put it in the background, because it is an extremely polluted river. The floodplains of Yamuna partially have been encroached upon in certain areas. And I think this can be a big threat, because if we have a once in a century kind of a flood situation, then what happens? So natural spaces, urban heat islands, and the way people live and work is I think should wake us up from the slumber. We clearly cities need to adapt, but I don't see that happening in many Indian cities. And which is why I had a couple of questions for our members here. I wanted to know whether this gap of this issue of equity, whether that can be addressed in cities, whether the way we access energy can be more equitable in cities. And the other thing that I wanted to know was, is there a way to retrofit existing infrastructure, housing, industry, offices? Is there a way to retrofit what is already there to ensure that we adapt better to climate change impacts?
Thank you very much, Jayashree. And I think you've addressed some really important points, and two very important questions. Energy equity when we're rebuilding these cities, and retrofitting houses in cities. I think Professor Lorraine Whitmarsh, would you like to take this one first?
Yeah, I can say a couple of things about this. I mean, I think it's really important to emphasize the equity dimension here, because as you've absolutely rightly said, that the people that are living with the worst impacts of climate change are the poorest people. They are the people that have the least resources to cope with those impacts, and it compounds existing types of vulnerability. So I think that's absolutely important to emphasize. I think what the polling and other research shows is that people who are on lower incomes still do care very much about climate change, sometimes even more so, precisely because they're seeing some of the impacts of climate change more sharply than people in developed countries. So I think they do care. And I think the evidence also shows that we can, a lot of the things we can do to tackle climate change can address issues around poverty and inequality as well. So some of the work by CPD, for example, they did a great report on co-benefits of climate action a year or two ago, which highlighted that most of the cities that are taking climate action are reporting wider additional benefits, co-benefits of that action. And a lot of that is around kind of getting people out of poverty, things like retrofits and increasing insulation being one of the key ways in which you can tackle both. Other work by the IPCC, Felix Kreutzig and others also highlight a lot of this as well. So there are more synergies and co-benefits than there are trade-offs from taking climate action and achieving wider goals, like wider sustainability goals, like addressing inequality. So I think I wanted to sort of say, I think it's absolutely right to emphasize this, and I think we can achieve both. And I'm sure others have more to say on those specific issues.
Thank you, Lorraine. Professor Kristoff Glade.
Thanks very much, and thank you for the question. I will speak a little bit on retrofits, because this really is a key thing that needs to happen around the world, not just in developing economies, but also in advanced economies. Retrofits very much are possible for the existing buildings. It's possible to improve insulation. It's possible to change the amount of energy which is consumed by buildings. And really, retrofits are very important, not only to reduce energy use, that will by itself reduce energy consumption and therefore can reduce people's bills. But there's lots of other benefits that come with retrofits. It can improve the comfort of homes. It can also reduce noise. It can reduce pollution in homes. There's a lot that can be done. The big problem is getting it done at the scale and pace that's needed. And this really is where governments need to step in to push the amount of retrofits which are occurring around the world. Every year we see a certain amount of the building stock around the world being changed, being retrofit. Unfortunately, the pace of that is not nearly high enough. Roughly speaking, we need to triple the rates of retrofits if we want to be on course for reducing emissions globally to zero by 2050. And not only do we need to increase the pace of these retrofits, we need to increase how deep they go, how big the emission reductions and the energy use are. And so what we see is that householders, people that own homes, people that live in homes really like it whenever buildings are retrofit, but having access to the capital and the money to bring about those retrofits can be very, very challenging. And so, as I say, this is where governments really need to step in to help and support those people that would like these retrofits, but can't necessarily afford them today.
Thank you, Kristoff. Professor Johan Rochon, I see you have your hand up as well.
Yeah, thanks. No, I just wanted to kind of combine Lorraine's and Kristoff's inputs here and build on your really, really great reflections, Jasri, to say that I think we're in a very important and quite exciting juncture where there's more and more momentum on integrating adaptation, which you focused on, how to manage the climate impacts hitting the most vulnerable, with mitigation, and to have an integration of mitigation adaptation into what the Working Group 2 of the IPCC in the recent report just a few weeks back emphasized as climate resilient development. And it could be good to mention that in the European Union today, the whole trajectory on adaptation is moving towards building climate resilience, defined as zero carbon adaptive capacity. So meaning that building fully on synergies between renewable energy investments and more adaptive capacities among the most vulnerable. And of course, the numbers of the win-win outcomes are just quite mind-boggling. I mean, we have so much evidence that up to 8-9 million people die prematurely every year just because of air pollutants related to fossil fuel burning, a number that is higher, still remains higher than the number of deaths related to the COVID-19 pandemic. So we're talking about big potential wins of going along a climate resilient pathway. And that's why I think that what we need to do in COP27 is to really, where you ended, Kristoff, is to put the money on the table. The international community must translate the loss and damage, that entire agenda into helping developing countries to move along a climate resilient plan so that we can afford to help in that transition.
Thank you, Johan. Also, I think Dr. Aranabi, your hand's up as well.
Thank you, Ade, and thank you, Jayashree, for your question. This has already been a very rich discussion. I wanted to address the first question you raised, Jayashree, about equity. I think this is the heart of the story. This is not just equity in international negotiations. We need to put citizens at the center of how we are thinking about urban development in terms of making sure that a climate resilient pathway is also consistent with an equitable pathway. I just want to illustrate this with 3 examples: cooking, cooling, and mobility. In India, as you know, Jayashree, there's been this big rollout of clean cooking energy LPG cylinders. But our survey at CEW shows that while even in urban India, this has gone up, the penetration has gone up from about 65% of households in 2011 to in 2020, 95% of the households exclusively using using LPG as a primary cooking fuel. It still shows that even in relatively richer urban India compared to rural India, there's still 5% of the households who are not using LPG as a primary cooking fuel. And as Johan was just saying, indoor air pollution is a major problem, not just from a climate change perspective, but from a public health perspective. So how do we ensure that the direct subsidies that are sent to the poorer, more vulnerable communities are sustained so that there is sustained use of cleaner cooking fuel? Similarly, with cooling, the point you talked about, heat stress, is absolutely critical. Now, we know that if we start putting air conditioners in every home, we will be heating up the planet while trying to cool it down. At least in the India Cooling Action Plan, the focus is on thermal comfort rather than just change of refrigerants use. But even then, the financing has to be specific. To give an example, we have right now for the super efficient fans, the market in India is about $1.6 billion, whereas the addressable market is $20 billion. Because the difference happens because the super efficient fans are that much more expensive, and therefore residents without end consumer financing aren't able to take this on. So again, better tax incentives to lower down the costs for super efficient fans could be both equitable, be climate friendly, and energy efficient. And finally, mobility. We did a survey across urban India, and we saw that more than 60% of urban Indians, their primary mode of transport are their 2 legs. So if you don't design cities which are for the people at large, then we will create an energy intensive infrastructure which will also be exclusionary. So the point you make about equity is not just an afterthought. It can actually be the driving force of designing more sustainable cities. I mean, urban India alone is now the world's 3rd largest country by population. So getting it right in cities across India could begin to serve it as a template in many other parts of the world. Thank you for your question again.
Thank you to our panel for answering that question. And isn't it exciting thought that, climate change and equity are 2 things that, or tackling climate change and dealing with equity are 2 things that can go hand in hand, and set us up for a greater future. But Jayashree, really, really good question. And thank you for kicking off our discussion. It's time. You're welcome. It's time to hand over now to Devi, who toured the world for over 2 years on her bicycle, a surly long-haul trucker, collecting personal accounts from people affected by climate change. She turned these stories into her moving book, 1001 Voices on Climate Change. Everyday stories of flood, fire, drought, and displacement around the world. Now, if you could first give us a bit of background on your experience with the climate crisis and your perspective on city and community resilience.
Yeah, first, thank you all so much for having me. It's really exciting to be a part of this conversation. And there's few things that I would wake up this early for on a Zoom call. So hello from the East Coast of the US. And,
what time is it there? Yeah. What time is it there?
7:19 in the morning, no big deal. But good morning, good afternoon, good evening from here. So yeah, this is the book I wrote, 1001 Voices on Climate Change. It's everyday stories of flood, fire, drought, and displacement from around the world, and includes a selection of stories that I documented over the course of 5 years, traveling. About half of that was by bicycle in 20 countries on 6 continents, with the goal of really just amplifying and diversifying the ways that we have these conversations about climate change. The language that we use to discuss these issues is often really abstract and inaccessible. And I found that it can be difficult for people to get their heads around, what a degree of temperature change means, or a millimeter of sea level rise for people's everyday lived experiences. So I traveled with a cardboard sign around my neck that said, "Tell me a story about water" on one side and "Tell me a story about climate change" on the other, and just listened. And that journey took me everywhere from Tuvalu, which is a coral atoll nation in the South Pacific that is experiencing really dramatic changes to their access to fresh water as a result of the salination of their water supply from sea level rise, all the way to the Canadian Arctic, where communities are not able to hunt in the same way that they did because of changing patterns of sea ice. And that has kind of downstream impacts on nutrition for these communities and people's just access to food. But right now, I want to briefly highlight too that I'm working at the Philadelphia Inquirer opinion section. So this journey led me sideways into journalism. I started freelance writing along the way and now work as an editor. And I'll drop this link in the chat, but this is like one of the kind of pieces that I get the chance to work on every day in the greater Philadelphia region. So this is a writer who's making the case that investing in clean energy will add over 126,000 jobs in Pennsylvania, and specifically advising how leaders in the state can work together to tackle the climate crisis. So in 2021, Hurricane Ida, the remnants of that storm, led to the deaths of at least 5 Pennsylvanians, and the Schuylkill River reached its highest point in 100 years, and has parts of the city experienced extreme flooding. And there's many residents who are still struggling to recover from that event. At the same time, we're currently in the midst of the warmest 30-year period on record. So what my role is, and again, just to keep this all super brief, but I think that stories and storytelling have a really important role in just changing the conversation, right? And for me, it's easier to activate empathy when we hear the voice of people who are directly impacted by these issues. And that's what my goal was to do in this book. So I hope if you're curious at it, curious about it all, you'll check it out. And I'm happy to talk about it more at length, but in the interest of time, wanted to keep it a bit brief.
Now, thank you so much for that, Devi. And I mean, your book sounds super, super interesting. And I think you hit the nail on the head. It is about individual experiences. It's about how it's affecting people. And to hear those voices is so, so important. We don't hear those voices enough. And I think what you're doing is extremely powerful. Now, we're opening the floor to our panel of scientists. And do you have any questions for them today, David?
Yeah, I mean, I guess, are there a couple questions. Are there questions that you guys wish you were asked more often about these issues, or ways that we could better, get the story of the science that you're doing out into the world? And if so, what might that look like?
Lovely question. Great question. Who would like to take this one now? Mark, I see Professor Mark Maslin.
So that's a really evil question, which is, what question do you want to be asked? I think what we are discovering after 30 years of science is actually just telling people how bad it's going to be and please change is not enough. What we need is to provide different ways and different narratives. And I think it's really important that we encapsulate all those different voices. So, for example, I, as a professor speaking, will not actually influence a group of indigenous people, but their leader, their sort of like the person that they respect, they will actually listen to. And I think that's what we need to do through this group and other groups, is to actually engage people and actually engage with what they're interested in. And again, I have to say, I have a lot of respect for communicators and scientists like say, Catherine Hayhoe. And her point is, you need to find out what the other person is interested in. If they're obsessed with football, or in American terms, soccer, then basically what you do is you engage with them, go, look, climate change is going to change things. Sort of like, you're not going to be able to go to your game, sort of like, it's going to be, have to be, you engage with them, and then they suddenly understand how it impacts their life. And again, we have to engage with normal people. And actually, I think it goes back to sort of like the wonderful question earlier about India. How do we engage with normal people? And it's about dealing with the issues that they're interested in. So making sure that we lift them out of poverty, we make sure that we look after them, make sure that they have heating and cooling at the same time, and doing that at the same time as that we're protecting their environment. So I think so this is why your book, giving voices to people that you've met around the world, is incredibly powerful. And I'm sure Lorraine will agree with me. It's those voices, it's the normal people's voices that people respond to, not aging professors like myself.
You've not got a single grey hair on your head, Mark. Professor Lorraine Whitmarsh, I see you've got your hand up as well.
Well, since I was name checked, but to be honest, Mark basically said what I would have said, really, which is absolutely understand your audience, tailor your message to what they care about. So more positive messaging is absolutely what we need, more solution focused stuff, so that not only are we highlighting normal people, and their experiences of climate change, but also we're highlighting normal people taking action on climate change and showing how their lives are better as a result of that. So it's about showing, hey, there's already people are taking action, it's working, and it's making their lives better. This, their health is improving, they're reducing their energy bills, etc. So those wider co-benefits, you can see the lived experience of those things through those good examples that people can show you. So yeah, it's really bringing climate action to life, I think, and having those positive narratives. So yeah, completely agree.
Great question. Thank you for the answers to our panel. And thank you, Devi. And great luck, good luck with the book. I really want to get hold of that and have a read of it myself. So next, we're going over to Tanya. And it's really lovely to have you with us. But please, could you tell us about yourself and your thoughts on city resilience in Mumbai?
Definitely. And thank you for having me here. It's really inspiring to know that youth are actively included in the conversation around climate change. So a little bit about myself. My name is Tanmay Takle, and I have an interesting job. I work with the Environment Minister of the government of Maharashtra. For context, Maharashtra is India's most urbanized state. I think it's most industrialized state too. And in my role, I work with him on anything and everything climate action. So let it be working with our cities to get them committed to something like the Race to Zero, or let it be working with a city like Mumbai that recently became the first South Asian city to announce a net zero aligned climate action plan. A lot of my work also involves at the state level, where we're working cross-departmentally to get everyone on board this common agenda that we have. So I am in the middle of the polity and the bureaucracy and the experts of this world, trying to kind of piece it all together and make sense in a way that is politically viable, that is in line with what the government's vision is, and ultimately in line with what the world needs going forward right now. It's great to see that the conversation is focused around cities in India, and maybe I'm biased as an author on the recently launched Mumbai Climate Action Plan, but I do believe Mumbai is really quite the lighthouse for not just India, but the global South at large, I would like to hope, in terms of how we're approaching this crisis. And it's true, a lot of the questions that have been asked about inequity in Mumbai, just some statistics I'm going to just shoot your way at the top of my head. But 40% of the city's population lives in informal settlements, and about 65% of the people in the city are employed in the informal sector. And equity is a huge issue at the city level, which is what I'll first get in, and then maybe outline how it looks in a state like Maharashtra, which is one of India's more coal-dependent states. In Mumbai, we did a full comprehensive vulnerability assessment for the city, in which we actually found out that informal settlements that often lack proper greening and proper construction are about 6 to 8 degrees warmer. I'm talking centigrade, not Fahrenheit, just to make that clear, 6 to 8 degrees centigrade warmer on average than other neighborhoods. In fact, neighboring, like just neighborhoods that are about a kilometer away in a city like Mumbai, in the month of October, you find out that there's a 4 degrees Celsius temperature difference in these neighborhoods. And just the construction, the kind of construction that's happening in these areas, coupled with, of course, urban greening available, raises big issues. And energy is a big lever for not just a city like Mumbai to tackle, where 70% of the city's emissions come from the energy and building sector, but also for not just even the state of Maharashtra, but for all of India, in fact. And in almost all of our cities, I think it would probably be fair to say that energy and buildings are these two key drivers of the transition. The inequities that kind of plague cities in India are plenty, and it's a challenge which our bureaucracies and politicians are kind of getting together to now tackle. So let it be something like working on air pollution or greening or flooding, which is a big concern for a place like Mumbai. In fact, in the Mumbai Climate Action Plan, something we tried to do was, once we had our vulnerability assessment and the greenhouse gas emissions inventory, we ran a huge campaign, and it was a total comms campaign, which basically took on the heavy task of communicating our findings to the citizens. The idea was to get feedback from each and every citizen who would be willing to engage. Obviously, that required a lot of contextualizing, regionalizing, and most importantly, de-jargonizing. Something which we can speak about equity all we want, but until and unless the terms around climate change are de-jargonized, there's going to be no true equity, and the just transition will just be a concept rather than something you see happen in action. It even included actually tying up with a radio network to, be able to blast the message across the city and putting up hoardings. And I do work with a politician, so I do have to, obviously ask myself, okay, is this going to be something the people at large are going to be able to take up? So in terms of Mumbai, the energy sector is the biggest lever that we want to hit, that we're hoping rather we can tackle successfully and it'll positively affect the huge population that lives in informal settlements. And with energy access, there's so many other things like access to sanitation or access to, even something like a computer or a cell phone that's coming into play, that our transition in some way or the other is interlinked with this aspirational feeling that at least in India I've observed. And by that, what I mean is we can make all the policy interventions to make EVs, very affordable. We can make all the policy interventions for super energy efficiency heating and cooling appliances. But the common people, and at least in my subjective experience, aren't necessarily thinking about what role can they play in the climate crisis. They're thinking about, okay, we want to kind of have that social mobility and we want to get a car first. It doesn't matter if it's an ICE or an EV at that point, because when you are in this vulnerable demographic, you want to get out of it. And that's the big challenge that we have to overcome, where we have to be mindful of this aspiration that the populace carries, but be able to package the transition in a way that merges and synergizes with this aspiration, instead of just plain virtue signaling or talking science at them. It's a lot, like some people before me mentioned, it's a lot about contextualizing the science that you do in something that resonates with the larger populace. With climate specifically, even if you look at different areas in a city, the issues that people resonate with will be very different. In a place like Mumbai, maybe in a more coastal side of the city, flooding will be a primary concern. Maybe in some other places, it'll be something like congestion that comes into play. Maybe in some other places, it will be air pollution, which is a big concern for not just Mumbai, but all cities in India. And I think the trick that we have as enablers of these ecosystems is to be able to kind of not necessarily present climate change or sustainable development as the silver bullet to everything, but rather be able to package all developmental decisions in a climate conscious manner that resonate with society at large. So I think that's my reflection on how we're looking at cities and addressing inequities. And now when it comes to asking a question, forgive me if I'm being too scathing, but and this is also largely informed by my personal experiences, but I often find that too often are youth burdened with the responsibility of building back better, but are very, very seldom times put in positions of power to be able to do so. So across all the sectors and areas and fields we're working in, I'd like to ask everyone that what would they like to do to help hopefully enable youth to take on this challenge which they've been tasked with.
Great question. And Tanmay, thank you so much for giving us your insights and for the work that you're doing, which is extremely important work. So over to our panel. This is a great question. How do we empower the youth, put them in a position to be able to deal with this crisis? Who would like to take on this question first? And also de-jargonizing. I think that's really important as well, because it's so funny how we can all speak the same language but still not understand each other. So I see Arunabha, Dr. Arunabha, you've got your hand up.
I'm going to throw this back at Tanmay, actually, because your intervention was so rich, so nuanced, Tanmay. Thank you for it. The question you've asked, if you could just talk to us about your own journey, how you've found yourself in a position that, as you said, intersects the polity, the politics, and the economy. I think that alone would help other youths listening to kind of feel inspired. So back at you.
Okay.
Skillfully done, Arunabha, skillfully done.
No, I do get asked this question a lot, so I'm very prepared for it. And I would say the answer is pretty simple. When you empower one young leader, they automatically empower more. And this is an exponential thing. In our case, we have a minister who is immensely proactive. And I mean, I'm a zealot about this stuff and he's on another level. And it's just so inspiring to see a 31-year-old young leader take the charge and, take a big step, like committing 43 cities from a state to race to zero, coming up with a state council on climate change that gets all different departments on board. So we've got a youth leader. And now what the youth leader did was manage to empower a few more youth who were bubbling with ideas, who were excited. So he actually empowered a colleague and a dear friend of mine called Saurabh, who's my partner in crime at this job. And together they had the idea with the department secretaries that we should have an internship or a fellowship program where we're able to get in young talent and be able to engage on this new things. Because let's face it, I mean, the jargon around climate is not something that has always been taught. This is a relatively newer field. Degrees are popping up in the last decade or so that focus on this. People are refocusing their studies even more in these decades to be able to identify and solve this problem better. So the idea was simple, to be able to get in fresh young talent that is excited enough to be able to make that change happen and not get bogged down by the system. That balanced with a really experienced bureaucracy helping out makes for a really synergistic idea. So through that fellowship program, I was part of the inaugural cohort actually, and I was one of the 10 fellows selected. In my time, I got to work on a lot of initiatives with the minister, including his COP engagements. So after that, I slowly transitioned into a more active role with the minister and kind of then on whatever was needed rather than just specific projects or plans. So I would say short answer, Arunabha, to your question is if you empower one youth leader, they will empower 10, those 10 will empower more. And I think that's the only way to make it happen. There can't be maybe again, too radical. I don't speak on behalf of any entity, only on myself. The idea that there's a separate youth COP and a COP, it carries this implication that, okay, that's the space for the youth and this is the space where the actual work really happens. So I think that connotation is something that we as a community need to maybe move a little bit away from. And again, really subjective experiences where at COP, I've had delegates from other states ask me if I was 12 and they were being flippant, trying to make conversation. But it really speaks to a huge bias that we have inside. So that's my answer. I hope that suffices.
Thank you very much. It's a great answer. Professor Mark Maslin, I see you've got your hand up as well.
So I think it's a really important question, but I think we have to be very careful about the first thing, which is seeing the really clear, obvious of like youth leaders coming through who are influencing politicians. But I think we also have to realize there's a quiet revolution going on in many countries where young people are demanding different things, and they're doing it in a very subtle way. So I work with a lot of CEOs, and actually some are incredibly positive about sustainability, and some of them are just hard-nosed and just don't care. But they care because they can't employ the best of the best. So young people now are going through, they're being educated, and they say, yes, I want a good job, I want to be successful, but I want to work with a company or an organization or NGO which has ethics and morals. And therefore, I want to feel good about my work. I also want to make sure my company is sustainable and actually has a climate change agenda. And so the interesting thing is, it's incredible that we have these brilliant youth leaders like yourself going out there empowering everybody, but we also have that quiet revolution where young people are going into companies and organizations and demanding that companies and organizations do things very differently to my generation.
Thank you, Mark, for that, and Tamne as well. Thank you for those those really great questions, and also just hearing what you do. Really, really important. So, time for us now to move on to Dafa. So, Dafa, it's great to hear from you, and it's great to have you with us today. And you and the Fridays for Future team are playing a really crucial role in organising community responses to the climate crisis in Jakarta. And Jakarta is a city whose very existence is under threat from climate change. It'd be really great to hear your thoughts on this issue.
Hey, firstly, am I audible?
Yes, there's some noise in the background.
Yes, I'm sorry, I'm in outside right now, but I will reduce the noise as long as I can. Yes. Maybe hello, good evening from Jakarta to everyone, and now it's 6:30 p.m. in here, and maybe firstly I would like to introduce myself first as well. So my name is Dafa Parite Devano Ramadan, or you can call me Dafa for short, and I'm currently based in Jakarta, and also I'm a college student and also one of the Indonesian environment activists. And besides of my role or my duties as a college student, I also part of Fridays for Future International, Southeast Asia climate activist, and the climate education now. And recently, on the 25th March 2022, I was joining and became an organizer of Global Climate Strike along with the Fridays for Future International. And I do my Global Climate Strike in Indonesia, which I do take responsibility to accommodate the strike across Indonesia. And in the previous global strike that I did, we demand 4 points, and those are: the first is declaring the climate crisis as a high priority issue on the national scale, and the second is prioritizing sustainable development which based oriented on climate resilience and security on fundamental matters. And the third is urgency to enhance ambition and the climate commitment, which is in line with the Paris Climate Agreement. And the last is security and safety are warranted for Indonesian people who strive to preserve and save their environment as their life. So, as we know, that Jakarta is one of the most populous city with more than 10 million citizens living there. And as the climate crisis actually was being the most prioritized matter to deal with in order to give more than 10 million people a proper life.
Dafa, sorry, could you just hold on there a sec? Is there any way you can make cut the background noise down, because it's very, very hard to hear you at the moment?
Maybe I will move to my phone and zoom in outside.
Because we can come back to you. We can move on to the next one and then come back to you once if it's clearer, because just right now it's very hard to hear you with what's going on in the background.
All right, okay, wait.
Okay, whilst So whilst we wait for Dafa to get his background noise sorted out, we're going to move on to a video here. And this is from David Miller. So I'd like to cross now to a short video from the former mayor of Toronto, David Miller, who's managing director of the C40 Centre for Urban Climate Policy and Economy. So here we go.
Hello, everybody at CCAG. It's David Miller, the Managing Director of the C40 Centre for Urban Climate Policy and Economy. I'm very sorry I can't be with you today, but I'm based on the west coast of Canada and it's a little bit early my time. So I did just want to bring a couple of very quick messages about the importance of cities to climate action. And very much thanks to Sir David and team for thinking about this really critical issue. By our calculations, about 70% of the world's greenhouse gas emissions can be attributed to cities and the activities needed to sustain them. And increasingly, people live in cities. As of about 10 years ago, the majority of the world's population. And we know that those greenhouse gases are concentrated predominantly in 4 areas: transportation, how we heat and cool buildings, how we manage our waste, and how we generate our electricity. And across the world, there are really important actions happening in a city somewhere that, if done at scale and pace, could help us move very quickly to get on a trajectory to halve overall emissions by 2030, as science shows us we must. The good news, in Glasgow last year, 1,000 more cities signed on to C40's high standards of climate action. The not so good news, cities haven't yet figured out the financing, the science, everything needed to act at scale and pace beyond the core of C40 cities, the largest cities in the world whose mayors are committed to action. I know that by partnering and collaborating, looking at the best science, the best policies, thinking about new and emerging economic thoughts, and thinking very, very much about how climate is impacting cities today, particularly in the developing world, and how we can build a resilient future. Collectively, by relying on science, we can help these mayors and the world succeed where perhaps our national governments have failed to do. I'm really looking forward to a continued collaboration, and I know Mark Watts, our Executive Director, is thrilled at the relationship between us. Good luck in the conversations today, and I look forward to our future work. Thank you.
Thank you so much, David, for those insights. And CCAG certainly looks forward to working with you on your mission to build climate resilience. Now, David really raises some very interesting points. And while many of the world's largest cities are committed to taking climate action, many other cities haven't figured out the financing or the science to work at the required scale and pace. So, question to our panel of scientists is, what can be done to inject urgency to drive forward the necessary change? Who would like to take that one on? How about you, Sir David? How do we drive forward this this change?
The reason my colleagues are hesitating in putting their hands up is because this is a very challenging question. What I think is critically important is for the city leaders to be developing a foresight program in which they develop a full understanding of the nature of the challenges lying ahead of them. Many of these cities that are feeling complacent at this point in time are not currently faced with extreme challenges of the kind we've heard about, say, from Mumbai. And in those cities, there's a kind of complacency developed. When we look at future-proofing, and this is where young people come in, when we look at future-proofing our cities, this is where we need to be taking on board all of the predictions being made by scientists for the world in terms of rising sea levels, rising temperatures, changing weather patterns, they can all be incorporated into planning for cities. It's only when you actually look not at just today, but in 10 years' time, 20 years' time, what the challenges are, that you can see the serious nature of this, because leaving it till later is simply going to be unaffordable, unmanageable going into the future. So I think this business of the idea of future-proofing, the idea of taking on board all of the challenges of the future is critically important.
Thank you, Sir David. Dr. Aranaba, I see you got your hand up as well.
Yeah, Ade, thank you. I'll come in and build on just what David was saying. I think the first step indeed is about trying to understand what the future will look like, because climate risks are non-linear, which means that you don't have a steady state understanding of the risks. It's also the case, therefore, that the past is no longer necessarily the predictor of the future. In India, the high resolution climate risk atlas that we are developing already shows that 3/4 of our districts are hotspots for extreme climate events. But what is more troubling is that we find that 40% of our districts are showing what is called a swapping trend, that where an area that was originally flood prone is now becoming drought prone, or vice versa. And therefore, even if you've built up all the capacity to deal with floods over the past few decades, you suddenly might have to build a local adaptive capacity to deal with droughts in future. That then brings me to the second part, which is about this adaptive capacity. In developing a climate vulnerability index, what we found is that one is, of course, the exposure to the hazards, but then it is the sensitivity of communities. And Tanmay's points about, the informality of many settlements becomes critical, because if I were living in an apartment block, my sensitivity to that storm surge would be very different if compared to if I were living in a shanty town. And then comes what we call the adaptive capacity. Does the local administration at the city level have the capacity to bounce back, not just save lives, but also rebuild livelihoods very quickly? So I think we need this kind of step-by-step approach to start understanding the future and not relying only on the past, to understand the different sensitivities of different types of communities, and then empowering local communities and local administration to actually build up that resilience over time. But one more point, and I know David has mentioned this on many occasions in the past, if we don't bring in the financial sector at this localized level, we will not be able to make this a reality. In fact, the report on climate risks that David and I had written along with others in 2015, we intentionally released it in the London and the Bombay stock exchanges simultaneously to draw attention that this is not just about a macroeconomic investment. This is about driving investment down to the city level in order to ensure that the infrastructure you're building is future-proofed, is modular enough to deal with those rising climate risks over time. And unless we have those granular on-ground solutions financially, it'll be very hard for the politicians, even if they have the right intentions in mind, to be able to translate their ideas into action.
Great. Thank you for that. I see we've got Kristoff. You've got your hand up as well. Let's hear from you.
Thanks, Ade. I would just like to mention briefly, drawing on some of the things that Mark and Lorraine were saying before, that optimism is quite often a better driver for people to take action, because I think we can be quite optimistic about some of these things whenever we're thinking about how can we reduce emissions in cities. There is a huge opportunity here for cities to take the lead, and huge benefits there will be for people in those cities besides reducing emissions. In terms of producing new jobs and new industries, we just heard from a mayor. Mayors absolutely love there being jobs being created and new industries coming about. But for citizens, by reducing emissions, you can also reduce air pollution, you can have higher quality of life, you can have lower vulnerability to climate impacts or to weather events. So it's not all about we need to kind of scare people into taking action. There are huge opportunities here that can, if people are aware of these opportunities, hopefully they will start to take the correct action and institute the right policies.
Thank you for that. I see we've got a few hands up. Please keep this brief because we do want to hear from DAFA as well. So Professor Johan Rochon, let's hear from you first.
Yeah, so I will allow myself to take a slightly contrarian view, and it's not that I am in any way at all not agreeing with you, Kristoff, and Arunaba, and Revi before, actually. Of course, we need the positive stories, and we have so much evidence of the win-win outcomes of how we can have a healthier, more prosperous, more equitable, more secure and peaceful future if we rapidly phase out fossil fuels. But at the same time, I think it's clear that we have followed what I call incrementalism for 50 years now. And we've simply been pushing the ball slowly down the slope with this belief that, we're not willing to have any big changes. Let's keep status quo running and just do some energy efficiencies and gradually move towards this target, because these are slow things changing very far in the future. And it's proven wrong on all accounts. The only thing you can criticize the IPCC for is that it has for 30 years underestimated the risk. The pace of change is happening faster. We've underestimated risks, and we're underestimating the irreversibilities. And today, at 1.2 degrees Celsius warming, we have nothing less than a global emergency point. We're supposed to cut global emissions by half in 8 years' time. It's a kind of a panic moment. And for that, I think you have to learn from the pandemic. In most countries in the world, developed countries, governments held press conferences every day. And what was the content in those press conferences? Did they tell beauty stories of all the good things happening with the pandemic? Oh no, they were actually counting death. They were counting the number of people who were dying. They were counting the people in intensive care and all the challenges and all the threats. And that made us all understand collectively that we had a problem. We had a real big problem. And the world rose collectively, and we suddenly have $15 trillion on the table for COVID recovery. 15 trillion, of which only 1 goes to sustainable recovery, which is an enormous failure. How can we fail when we had this opportunity of linking the health trajectory to a more sustainable landing? So I think we have to mesh this together. Not be afraid of telling the truth on all the risks, which are now catastrophic risks, and all the impacts, and just load the impacts and then hammer that out, because people need to know that. When you have a disease, you want to get the right diagnostics. But of course, you have to get the right cure as well. I totally agree that. But I think we should not back off from the dark side of this story as well, because we're in the midst of it.
Thank you, Professor Johan Rochon. It's really important we keep it real, and you're right. There are so many lessons that we need to learn from the pandemic to help us get through this climate crisis. I'm going to go back to DAFA. DAFA, how are you? Are you set up? Let's hear from you.
Yes. How about now?
Thank you. Yeah, I think that sounds a little bit better, but yeah, can you just give us a little insights into what you do, and then ask your question as well, please?
Or okay, so as I previously mentioned, I do take responsibility to accommodate the strike across.
So I think we're having problems with DAFA's line here. So I've got his question, actually. Sorry about this, DAFA, if you can hear us. We're having problems hearing you, but I do have your question down here, and I'll ask it to our panel. And it's, is it possible to make cities more resilient and sustainable while the people living there don't seem to care about the environment and are often living in poverty? So I'll throw that one out to the panel. How do we get the people to care about the cities that they're living in, especially when poverty is something that their day-to-day poverty is something that they're having to deal with? Professor Lorraine Whitmarsh.
So I sort of partly answered this earlier, but there was this, the biggest ever poll of the public took place a couple of years ago by the UN. And they managed to poll over 50 countries, representing half of the global population. And they found that basically almost everybody is concerned about climate change. And some of the poorest countries and regions in the world are also very concerned. And so I think people do care, even if they are poor. And as we've talked about earlier, they are actually experiencing some of the worst impacts. So that may be why they're particularly concerned. I think it also comes back, but how can we get people to sort of to care and to do more? I think it does come back to this point about reframing action around these wider benefits and the fact that, it is about actually helping people out of poverty. We know that the people that have the biggest carbon footprints are the people on the highest incomes. So it is about helping those people on the lowest incomes to insulate their homes, to improve their quality of life, and taking a lot of climate actions can achieve those wider co-benefits in terms of equity. So highlighting that, I think, can bring people on board that might otherwise say, I can't afford to do this, or I don't have the time to do this, or this isn't a priority to me. It is about saying this is going to achieve what is, what you need and what you value as well.
Yeah, it's definitely, I mean, we've alluded to it quite earlier on as well in terms of, de-jargonizing the language, making people understand more, and also finding a way, as Mark mentioned before, of connecting, finding what makes people care. And talking about Mark, I see you've got your hand up as well.
So in the same sort of way that Johan has, let's keep it real. Okay, so the first thing is 7 million children die every year needlessly due to preventable diseases and starvation. 825 million people go to bed feeling hungry every night. That's actually gone up by 25 million in the last 5 years. And 1 billion people still do not have regular access to safe drinking water. That's where we're at the moment. So we have to lift these people out of extreme poverty. But by doing that, we can actually use that as a way of actually decarbonizing and improving their environment. And so we look at that development progress where we put money to actually alleviate poverty, but we do it in the right way. We do it to protect their vulnerabilities. We make sure that sort of like they are safe, and we make sure that we do it in the best way possible for them, but also for their local environment and for the global climate. And I think that's key. Whether they know that they're having clean energy, I don't think really matters, as long as we can lift them out of poverty in the right way.
Thank you, Professor Mark Maslin, for that answer. And Dafa, I'm really sorry we couldn't get your sound working right. Hopefully we'll be able to get you on again at some point in the future, so we can hear more from you. But also thank you so much for your question. It was a really, really good question. Okay, so it's nearly time for us to finish. Unfortunately, we haven't got much more time left today, but big thank you to our CCAG team, and we'll be launching a full report on this subject of sustainable cities next month. So if you're interested in reading more about this, keep an eye out on the CCAG website. A really big thank you to our special guests, Dafa, Tanmay, Devi, and Jaishri, for joining us today. I hope you all found the discussion as informative as I did. I thought it was very, very fascinating this week. And as always, a huge thank you to our experts, our CCAG scientists, for their time today. Finally, thank you to everyone at home for watching. And if you have any questions on city resilience, then please do send them to us on any of our CCAG social media channels. Join us next time for our April public meeting on Thursday, the 28th of April. See you then. Take care.
The situation with climate change is clear. The crisis is not being managed in the way it needs to be managed at the moment. I am Sir Dave King. I have set up a climate crisis advisory group. The group represents the international experts on climate change to be available to the public, to policymakers, and to the media around the world. We need action now. What we as humanity do over the next 5 years will, in my view, determine the future of civilization.